So, welcome to a new episode of We Went Off Rails or Nos Fuimos al Pasto. Depends on if you are a Spanish listener or somebody who speaks English. This is a podcast that dives into the fascinating world of dairy production, farming, and cows. We are Nico, Martin, Gabi, Gonza, and Jose, that's me, here to bring you fresh insights. In this space, we'll talk about production systems from different parts of the world, dive into dairy concepts, and explore realities from various countries. We'll also spotlight the latest trends and technological innovations transforming the way farming is done globally, featuring interviews with producers, scientists, and specialists. So let's get started. And today we have a very special guest with us. So DERRECK MOOT, Professor DERRECK MOOT, who's joining us from the other side of the world. Again, we have somebody from New Zealand. So in our last episode, we had a guy also in New Zealand. And we're very grateful to have you here, Derek. We know it's you're a very busy person, and trying to get the time zones in line is usually very hard. So it's part of your weekend. So we're really grateful to have you here. If you want
So
to go
Jose,
ahead and yes, sir.
you know what people say when you want things done, you ask to a busy person. So,
Yeah, yeah, agree,
so I'm
agree.
sure he's very organized.
He is, yes. So Derek, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be great, and then we can start talking about some of the topics we'd like to cover today.
Well, Jose, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm not going to enlighten your listeners much about dairy cows because that's not my background or interest, but I am a pasture science specialist and a crop physiologist, and I understand grazing systems. I am a professor of plant science at Lincoln University in the South Island of New Zealand, and I work predominantly on sheep and beef systems. But I'm also aware of most of the things that are happening in the dairy sector in New Zealand as well. If you're teaching, you need to be across all aspects of agriculture, and so that's what I do.
Agreed. Okay. Yeah. It's fun. We've had people talk about pastures and not just dairy in general. So perhaps the introduction should be corrected. We'll do that in the next episode. So Derek, first I'd like to start. I'd like to give a brief introduction of how we met, because this is we've known each other for a while, and there's an interesting story. I think I've told it in Spanish, but it'd be good for the audience to know how we met. And I remember that ecophysiology course. You came to Argentina in 2014, I think it was, and you came to teach a course, a postgraduate course. And I remember I was doing my PhD at that time, and my thesis advisor, Monica, she said, "You have to go take this course." And when you're a PhD student, you pretty much do whatever your advisor tells you to do. And I said, "Sure, I will." And I remember going to Pergamino, which is a city in the north of the province of Buenos Aires. This is central Argentina, and the course was really fantastic. I mean, it was eye-opening. It just opened my eyes to new ways of actually managing lucerne pastures. We were originally told how to manage pastures in general, following cut and carry operations and grazing rules from the US essentially. And you came with a new perspective and physiology perspective, and the course was really interesting. But at the time, I remember that while they were translating, which was fun, it was there was a guy, Daniel, who was translating, I think, and while he was translating, he kept saying, he kept adding his own words and saying, "Yeah, he's saying this and that, but this won't work in Argentina." I was like, I felt sort of ashamed, but eventually. We talked on the field. We went to the field. We talked there. That day, I brought you back to your hotel, and I said, "Hey, I'd like to know more about Lucerne." And right there, you invited me to go to New Zealand, which was I was like surprised. You said, "No, you should come to New Zealand and learn more about Lucerne." Um, and that sort of started everything. So this is to give you. We always talk in this podcast on how some sometimes it's random situations or things that you go through and eventually make a difference in your life. And I think that that was sort of a turning point in my life, in my career, because eventually that led to me finally being in New Zealand and working with you. So that's sort of to give you a perspective, and also that sort of brings this introduction into understanding, because everybody that thinks about New Zealand thinks about ryegrass, right, and white clover, and so the first thing that nobody thinks about lucerne too much. Well, right now they are. We talk a lot more about lucerne in New Zealand, but that was not like that 20 years ago. So what prompted you? What made you think about lucerne as a pasture that was worth studying? What did you see there, and how did that start essentially?
Yeah, I remember that visit well, Jose. It, it was an interesting time for me. I think it was also interviewed on the radio, and the same thing was happening. But that's okay. You know, my philosophy is that science's job is to challenge management. So we do science to challenge management, and we do science either to challenge our managers, or we do science to challenge the management of the crop or the pasture that we're working on.
Right.
And if we come from a science basis, then we can challenge anything. And that's really how we operate, because we're evidence-based people. And for me, I had done a little bit of work on lucerne or alfalfa when I was an undergraduate student, and I did an honours study in that area. And then I left the area, I went into crops, and I did my PhD in crops. And I went to the UK and did my postdoc. And I was working in the UK on climate change, and this is the early 1990s. So you're really at that time working with the first scientists who are saying climate change is going to happen and what are the implications going to be for agriculture. And so, as a complete skeptic of climate change at that time, I did a little bit of investigation into the background of climate change and went, yeah, actually, the physics works. If we keep pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, we're going to trap long wave radiation. It's called the greenhouse effect. It's very straightforward. It's happening. What can I do about it? Well, the answer to what I can do about it was not very much. But I then got offered a position back in New Zealand, and I thought, well, I can't actually stop people burning fossil fuel, but maybe I can adapt our farm systems to be resilient to the inevitability of climate change. And for the area, the region that I work on, it's the east coast of New Zealand. And you're right, most people think of New Zealand and think of ryegrass, white clover, and dairy cows. And that's true for large parts of the country where dairy is dominant. And that's where we've got 1,000 mils of rainfall, or we've got centre pivot irrigation of some description. But there are large areas of the country that are not in that situation. They have 350 to 650, 700 mils of rainfall. And so they are summer dry, and they expect to be dry through the summer. And those were the regions that were predicted to have the greatest impact of climate change, being a drier climate. And so I returned to New Zealand into a lecturing position in the early 1990s, and the talk was all about chicory, this deep-rooted plant that was going to change production systems. And I just couldn't get my head around how chicory was going to do that. So I thought, well, this isn't what I believe. I actually think there is a tap-rooted species that we've got out there that works pretty well, and it's called alfalfa or lucerne. And why aren't we using it? So we surveyed the farmers, and they all knew, the farmers in this region knew how good lucerne was. But as you rightly pointed out, they were predominantly cut and carrying it. And they were doing that because they'd been told they have to wait for the crop to flower at 10%. You've got to get to 10% flowering before you can cut this plant. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. But the second year I was there, I put in an experiment comparing chicory, red clover, and lucerne in a soil right next to my office, irrigated and dryland. I just wanted to see what their production potential was. And it was pretty clear lucerne was the winner. It survived longest. Red clover was gone in 3 years. Chicory, we had the first year stem problem, then the population crashed. After 3 years, I still had a magnificent lucerne stand. But I'd grown the lucerne to 65, 70 centimetres, and it still hadn't flowered. So I was essentially growing tree trunks that, the stems were as thick as my thumb. And I'm thinking, why have I done this? What is the point? But that was the message that our farmers had. So I decided it was time we had a look at whether we could make lucerne more flexible in its grazing. And To do that, we needed to identify what the problem was for the farmers. And the main pinch period for our farmers is lambing.
Yeah.
So basically, most farmers in the South Island have to grow a winter forage. So they've got to grow a winter feed crop, a brassica or Italian ryegrass or something like that to get through the winter because the temperatures are too cold. But spring is a crucial period. You've got a huge increase in numbers because you've got lambing happening, and we're talking 140, 150% lambing. So your demand is going through the roof, and you've got this plant that's really precious that you've got to wait to flower before you can use it. It doesn't fit a farm system.
Now,
So
sorry, Derek, was that based on any physiology at all, or what was that? I always struggle to actually understand because they talk a lot about carbohydrates, and they sort of see the plant as this machine that was pumping carbohydrates into the roots, and that's what we were told at the uni, actually. So, and when it got to 10% flour, it was like, okay, the tank is now full, and now eventually there's no need to wait any longer. So was that actually based on physiology, or what was the science behind
yes,
that?
it was. Yes, it was. And the science is real. So if you cut the plant, it has to reestablish its canopy of leaves from basal buds or a new set of shoots that grows after every cutting. And then it goes through that cycle of depleting the carbohydrate, and it's actually the nitrogen reserves. So it's depleting the nitrogen reserves in the crown, and those nitrogen reserves are being used to create the new stems. And the carbohydrate goes down as well, but really the carbohydrate is the energy source
Hmm.
that's moving the nitrogen around, because it's the nitrogen that's the scaffolding or the important part of growing the new plant and the new shoots. So once you get to 10% flowering, then the plant actually does prioritize putting things under the ground. So it
Hmm.
does start to replenish those root reserves. But and so that was the thing that most of us had looked at, the cycling of carbohydrate, and very much a very North American approach to it. And there'd been a lot of work done by the North Americans on that. But what they were missing was that there's an overriding photoperiod effect
Hmm.
going on as well. So in the spring period, or when the photoperiod is getting longer, the lucerne plant is acting like an annual, and it just wants to grow shoots. So it uses up those reserves anyway. So it actually has a reduction in carbohydrate and nitrogen below ground to grow shoots. So if you give it a chance, it actually wants to be its most productive in the spring.
Hmm.
Now, that actually fits a lactation curve that I've got with my ewes and lambs, where my demand has just gone through the roof in spring, and I've got a plant that really wants to grow for me. But instead of grazing it, I'm letting it get to 10% flowering, which is tree stalks.
Yep.
And then I try and put the animals in it. Well, I don't, because I just cut it. And I think I'll save that for alfalfa, I'll save that for hay or silage. And traditionally, then I would wean my lambs and put them into the lucerne to try and get them to grow. Now I'm putting weaned lambs into a lucerne stand. They've never seen the plant. Their gut isn't adjusted to the plant, and they stand around and walk around the outside of the paddock for 2 or 3 days before they start nibbling the tops. So a complete mismatch of
Yeah.
requirements. So the thing that really got us onto it was we looked at the irrigated lucerne stand over a 3-year period and measured its biomass. And in the irrigated stand, you can think of lucerne as it hasn't got any irrigation, so it's got no water stress.
Hmm.
It's got nitrogen because it's a nitrogen fixer, so you don't have a nitrogen problem. So the only thing really driving your growth rate is temperature. And under the same temperature in the spring and the autumn, we were getting 2 different growth rates. And I'm talking 40 to 50 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day difference in growth rates. And so the question became why. And so we started, and that was the first PhD really. Hamish Brown, a PhD student of mine, and he finished the red clover chicory lucerne work and came up with this big growth rate differences. And then I had a student come from Brazil, Edmar Teixeira, and he actually had the job of digging the roots. So he had to get in there and look at a new crop and
Yeah.
actually dig the roots up
That's a
for
lot of
2
fun.
years.
Digging
Yeah,
is a lot
well,
of fun.
Well, science is hard work, you know. We sell an ideal when we have science students.
Yes.
We tell them it's wonderful, but they don't realize that it's 95% perspiration and just the 5% inspiration.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yes.
Digging roots is not the fun part, but the results are, and
Yeah.
his results were really conclusive. We saw that carbohydrate increase and depletion within the cutting cycles, but more importantly, overriding it was this effective photoperiod. So I explained to students that the lucerne is acting like a deciduous tree.
Hmm.
In the spring, it's taking all of the carbohydrate and nitrogen that it's got stored in its roots and its crown, and it's pumping it into the leaves, just as a blossom tree is producing leaves and producing fruit for us. But then once we get to a decreasing photoperiod, and for us, that's about the third week of January, when the photoperiod can be detected as changing, then the lucerne starts reprioritizing building up its root reserves. And so once we knew that, we said, well, let's actually start abusing this crop. Instead of treating it as the precious queen or princess, let's actually make it the serf or the slave and really make it work for us. So
Yeah.
we said, well, let's put ewes and lambs on it. And so we started doing that, and we've now just recently just about to publish a paper from some work that one of my recent PhD students has done, showing that actually the lucerne really takes off after an 11.1 hour photoperiod. So it actually holds, and the height really doesn't change very much. This is an FD5 in our environment. I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's going to be the same all over the world, but for us, a 4 dormancy 5 lucerne cultivar really takes off and grows after we get past about the 3rd of September. And it doesn't matter what we've done to it in the 4 months before then, whether we grazed it 4 weeks ago or 4 months ago, it's that period when it takes off. And so that gives us a start point as to when we can expect to have rapid elongation of the stem and a rapid increase in lucerne production. So we now have farmers who are starting a 6 paddock rotation with ewes and lambs lambing onto the lucerne stands when it's about 10 centimetres high. And they're lightly set stocked across about half of the whole lucerne area. And then they box the animals up and start a rotational grazing system. And this might be 750 merino ewes and lambs, or it might be, when I'm saying ewes and lambs, that's 750 ewes with their lambs.
Right.
Okay, so big mobs,
Yeah.
and again, you're using science to challenge management. So the management of merinos in New Zealand was always don't touch them during lambing, leave them alone. They're flighty, they'll run away from their lamb. You'll have huge lamb losses. Well, we didn't find that. If you give them good quality feed, they stayed close to their lambs. They actually looked and said, "Oh, I've given birth," instead of
Hey,
in our
Derek,
situation. They've come out of the
sorry,
winter.
Derek,
Yeah,
just a question there. I work with people from Ecuador. So the interesting thing about that country is that they don't have a change in the photo period.
yep,
So and they do work with lucerne. So and one of the things we were talking about, I didn't have an answer, but they were wondering what would be the implications of not having a photo period in that part of the world. Any thoughts on that or any comment?
without a photoperiod response, I suspect then they've got to use an extended period of grazing at some point in time to rebuild those reserves. So for me, without much photoperiod change, just coming back to first principles, I would suggest they use the lucerne however they like, but at one period in the year, they give it about 6 weeks or whatever the temperature regime may be. They give it a long period to do that flowering
Okay.
and let those carbohydrate reserves build up and nitrogen reserves build up under the ground. So in our situation, we graze about every 350 thermal units, which is about when the plant has 10 nodes. It's about 30 centimetres high. That's our target. And if we graze it at about 30 centimetres, now I said we start with ewes and lambs when it's about 10 centimetres high. And the reason we do that is because we've got to start before our 6th paddock gets going, because otherwise our 6th paddock will be 40, 50 centimetres high when we go into it. So we're trying to make sure that by the time we've set up a rotation, we're always going into about 30 centimeters of height. If you don't have a photoperiod response in Ecuador, Gonzalo, my suggestion would be that at one period, they allow an extended period of flowering.
Okay.
So they just give it a longer period. So they let
Yeah.
it get to 13, 14 nodes. They give it maybe 500 thermal units at some point. And just by the nature of the plant, when it flowers, it will, as we discussed earlier, it will start putting carbohydrate reserves and nitrogen reserves back under the ground. And that will increase its longevity. The only caveat to that is if they're using cultivars with a very high
FD10.
fall dormancy,
Yeah. That was going to be
10
my
or
next
11,
question. What do you do? Because there's the implications of such weather in general mean that they use FD9, FD10, same situation in Argentina. So I think there, what happens there? I mean, and you have there's published papers from your team, Derek, evaluating FD2, 5, and 10. So what would you do there? I mean, does it still make sense? The question would be, does it make sense to use FD10 as a grazing plant or not?
it makes sense if you only want the stand for 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
If it's a short period of time, or that you know you've got other soil conditions that are not conducive to a long period, a 6 to 8 to 10 year stand, then it would make sense to use those higher fall dormancies. But from our work, the higher fall dormancy means they've lost that photoperiod sensitivity. So we think, and I haven't done the genetics, but we think that creating that fall dormancy, those higher fall dormancies, has actually been breeding out that ability to respond to photoperiod. And the thing to remember is that the plant is then growing itself to death. It has no signal to put carbohydrate reserves. And at that point, you might be coming back to 10% flowering and trying to get some reserves into the plant. Personally, I think it might make more sense to have one period of extended flowering to allow some build-up of carbohydrate and nitrogen reserves. So there's a definite trade-off between persistence and productivity. And remember what fall dormancy actually means. Okay, so fall dormancy means that I planted the plant in the spring, I cut it, and then I went to the fall and I measured how tall it was. And that's it.
That's the only measurement. Exactly.
That's the only measurement. That is what fall dormancy means. And then there is a set of check cultivars. Some of them are small, short, and some of them are tall. And a new cultivar is based on that set of check cultivars. Where was its height? And so what you have in high fall dormancies is that they continue to grow, they continue to elongate their stem in that autumn period, when I actually want my plants to shut down and put stuff under the ground and be ready for next year. But in Ecuador, Gonzalo, if they've got beautiful conditions the whole year round, an FD10 is likely to grow itself to death. And I have the same situation when I talk to people who are growing alfalfa in the Middle East, or they're growing alfalfa in Ethiopia, and they've got 40-degree temperatures and irrigation, and the plant is back to 30 or 40 centimeters within 16 or 17 days. So it then comes back to understanding what the plant's doing and recognizing that if you want longevity, you've got to give it a rest. You've got to give it a chance to drop the quality for one cycle and build up those reserves again. Or the plant, by its very nature, particularly the 8, 9, 10s, and even 11s, I think we've got now,
there's 11.
They are not conducive to persistence. So it's a trade-off. And Argentina is a big country. You got, right down from Patagonia up to the north of Argentina, and then into Ecuador that Gonzalo's talking about.
The thing with Argentina, though, it's funny because we do have a lot of different climates and different conditions, but essentially most of our cultivars are 8, 9. So even in the south, I mean, not in the deep south. I mean, if you go to Patagonia, there's going to be 5 or 6. but there's just one FD5 in all of Argentina, and there's nothing below that. And if you ask for seed of an FD5 at this stage, I don't think you will even get any, not one kilo of that seed. So it's interesting because we have sort of made the same model, like the same type of plant for all of our conditions, which does not really fit. I mean, it's a very long country and very wide in terms of climate, but that's what's happened. And perhaps for Ecuador, the difference would be that they are, I think those farmers are all above 2,000 meters in height. So it's going to be quite cold. Probably they might be using lower FDE because there's probably very interesting frosts at that height. So yeah, but it's always an interesting question because we've seen a lot of new techniques, new ideas, and essentially since you came down here, Derek, there's been changes in the way people are managing their lucerne pastures. But this is like a pendulum. Like we went from 10% flower to now people managing just everything at 350 growing degree days and no rest whatsoever. So they're just losing the stance at 350. And now they're swinging back to the other side. And here's the next question, which is one of the topics we wanted to cover, which is they're talking about regenerative ag, right? And there's a regenerative management of lucerne pastures, which I don't want to sound blunt, but really from the data I've seen so far is really not good. I mean, we are losing about 2 tons of dry matter consumption when we manage lucerne pastures in the regenerative way, which is very long resting periods in high growing seasons, in spring. So, and you've done work on this as well. So, what are your thoughts on this? And then, what are the implications of managing pastures using this new regenerative ag perspective?
That's a loaded question, Jose. I think the first,
Sorry,
the first question
I'm
to
being
always
South
ask
American
someone,
again. Sorry.
yeah, well, the first thing to ask people whenever they're talking about regenerative agriculture is to get them to define what they actually mean.
Hmm.
So I'll take it that you mean long grazing rotations with high covers on entry and high residuals. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that's I can see that as a regenerative idea. And you come back to the same issues that we were talking about before. You grow tree trunks in the spring
Hmm.
and you lose production. So when I'm growing those tree trunks and delaying that grazing period, then I'm losing productivity. And so the question becomes, how much productivity are you prepared to lose?
Hmm.
And we have the same issues happening in New Zealand around regenerative agriculture. But let's just stick with the regenerative alfalfa program. If you're wanting to look after the plant and look after the animals, then the most important thing you can do is give the plant that rest in the autumn. So you said everyone's grazing on a 350. That's fantastic, except I get my farmers at one point in the autumn to give it a 500 or 550 period.
Yeah.
And that's sort of halfway between intensive management and regenerative. And I don't call it regenerative, I actually just call it best management practice. I'm utilizing the plant when I need it, when I've got a lot of mouths to feed in the spring and through the summer. But I recognize that in the autumn, I have to look after the plant. I have to regenerate the reserves so I can turn around that idea of regeneration. Going into a high pre-grazing pasture mass, let's say 5 ton of biomass, which would be a 50 centimeter, 55 centimeter tall lucerne stand, something like that. If I go in and eat that, the animals are going to leave behind 20 centimeters of stem and leaf and put it on the ground. And that's basically wasted. And some of the regenerative fraternity would suggest that's a good thing because that puts carbon into the soil, that soil health, the ill-defined concept of soil health is promoted. but I'm a production person, and actually all of those stems, I would mow them off so they become organic matter. But they've been a waste. If I'd grown one crop of 60 centimeters, I'd have been better off growing two crops of 30 centimeters and then giving it the rest in the autumn, and then having, maybe I've got a bit more stem left behind, maybe I'm not grazing it as intensively, and maybe I want to top that up, put a machine across it and have those stems fall onto the ground and become part of the organic matter. But remember, all of that organic matter is just food for microorganisms. So there's a real difference here. People need to understand that soil health and soil microbiology are basically just increasing bugs to eat the carbon that's been fixed from photosynthesis. And they are respiring. And so that CO2 is going back into the atmosphere. The only carbon that is truly fixed into the soil carbon pool is the carbon that is attached to the soil particles. And once you have full saturation, which under a grazing system, we generally have saturated soils anyway, because we've been grazing, we haven't been cropping, so we haven't been releasing a lot of that organic matter into the atmosphere. So under a heavily cropped system, you can build soil carbon. But under a pastoral system, you generally can't, because you've already got very high levels of soil carbon. You can increase the organic matter, and my soil scientist are always excited by increasing the organic matter, and I'm happy for them to do that. But I've got a plant that already fixes nitrogen. I just need to make sure it's got phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium available. And part of that process is the animals actually eating the plant and urinating and recycling those nutrients back into the system, so that the only stuff I'm taking off is in the animal product. Completely different from a cut and carry system where I'm removing all of the nutrients from the field. So grazing system to me is already regenerative, but if we wanted to be, well, as I said, best management practice in a lucerne stand is to give the plant a rest, have that high pre-entry grazing at one period in the autumn. And your colleague Human showed that very nicely with some beef cattle work that he did, that we published a few years ago. I mean, he did a wonderful job of that experiment showing exactly that, and the productivity gains that can be achieved from that system.
It's funny because one of the things I keep seeing on some of the published information, like when they talk about regenerative grazing or holistic grazing or other proper names like that, in general they compare bad management practices, right? So they compare continuous grazing and it's like saying, yeah, if you put phosphorus on the soil, then plants are going to grow better. We all know that, right? There's nothing new there. So every paper I've read so far on those types of management have not compared actually best management practices. So that's why I think there's a bit of confusion in some of the principles that I've seen apply. And I don't know if you agree with this, but like let's take holistic grazing, for instance. Those principles came from Africa, right? So they came from areas where there was a very dry season, a very short grazing, a very short actually growth period. And so those principles and natural grasslands. So in general, they were not very good soils. And then they try to apply that to a system in the Pampas of Argentina, which is like the most fertile soils in the world after there's Ukraine and other areas of the US, but it's very fertile and they try to apply the same principles there. And I think they're just failing to see that it's not a one size fits all, and it's just that the principles are wrong. I don't know if that's happening in New Zealand as well, or what your experience is.
Yeah, yes, we have the same sort of experiences. So you come back to first principles. If you leave pasture to grow, it will become carbon dominant. And so if you let the pampas grow, you'll get a lot of grass. And that grass, if that ends up in the soil, will actually tie up nitrogen. And so you decrease productivity. And I was always struck when I went to Patagonia that the conversation was always about which grass do we need to grow in this system. And I just couldn't get my head around the idea that we wanted a grass in that system. In Argentina and in South America, the first thing you need to deal with often is phosphorus. And a lot of the literature comes out of North America and the Northern Hemisphere, where it's nitrogen. They've got phosphorus, so they've got access to phosphorus. So nitrogen is what drives it. In New Zealand, we have phosphorus, but we've got access to it. It's nitrogen that drives our system. So there isn't a one size fits all. And when you have regenerative principles, you need to understand that if I've been cropping for 100 years, I have diminished the soil carbon levels.
Yeah.
And I can build them up by a fallow period or a period of a crop that I mulch or a period of rest or a period of grazing. And those principles have come from areas of Australia and the US, big, large areas. But if you've got fertility, then those principles no longer are required. And the interesting thing from our perspective, so two things, you asked what's happening in New Zealand. So two things. We had the regenerative wave hit about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was very favoured by the government, and it sounds wonderful. So the government's actually invested some money in comparing. So we actually have an 8-hectare farmlet that we're running at Lincoln University. And what we've got is two systems on two phosphorus levels. So Ulsan P10, Ulsan P20. My conventional system, which is a lucerne grazing system with cocksfoot or orchard grass and subclover being the main pasture. So that's the grass-based pasture and the lucerne. So that's all we've got. And then we put some winter forages in versus a multi-species, 15 species regenerative mix. And we have a technical advisory group that assists us with that. And after the first 2 years, we really hadn't seen much difference, but we're starting to see some differences in the third year. The legume is disappearing out of the high grass multi-species mix, and that happens. That's what we've done a lot of work on pasture mixtures. We had one experiment we ran at Lincoln with 274 plots, every possible combination of 6 species. So monocultures, binary mixes, 3 species mix, 4 species mix, 5 species mix, and the 6 species mix. All of them that we could have, as big as we could have them. And what we found was it didn't matter what you were doing, 2 or 3 species was it, a grass and a legume.
Yeah.
Now, a technical advisory group have started off in the high residual scenario. So some of them are farmers, and they started that. And they've come to the same conclusion. And they're actually going, really, we need to be entering grazing at about 3 tonne and going out at about 1,500, which is exactly what most of our dairy farmers say.
Right.
And I always make the point that once you get above about 3 tonne, it doesn't matter what the species is. I'm talking temperate species here rather than your tropical C4 grasses. Once you get above 3 tonne, you then have to have structure. So you lose quality because you've got to hold the plant up. So why is our dairy entry at about 3 tonne? Because once you get beyond that, you start having respiration. Yeah. Maintenance respiration is too high, and you need structure. With my alfalfa or the lucerne, the same thing. I get above 30 centimetres, I start to all I do is increase stem.
Right.
I've only ever got 3 tonne of good quality feed in that pasture. I can grow a 6 tonne crop, but 3 tonne of it is stem. I can grow a kale crop, and if you look at a kale crop and do the same maths with it, you'll find a kale crop has 3 tonne of leaf. So the rest of it becomes structure. So I've got a 15 tonne kale crop, but actually there's about 3 tonne of leaf. And, that it's just first principles. Once you start getting big yields, your maintenance respiration requirement becomes too big. All of your sugar from today's photosynthesis is being used up just to maintain the herbage that you've got. So if you've got an entry of 5 or 6 tonne of biomass under a regenerative or holistic grazing system, you have to have dead material in that system.
Exactly.
There's dead material in the base, and it's, you've lost productivity. It's first principles.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Jose, it's interesting. But 2 things. One thing, what Jose is saying, that I agree with you, Jose, that many times when we compare what is regenerative for people is always something good against a very, very bad management. So we tend to think, okay, regenerative is the best thing to do, or this is the best place to go because we're coming from a very bad place. And the second thing is what you said, Derek, at the beginning, is what people actually mean with regenerative. And it seems to me there's a lot of confusion. And that takes me to my question, Derek, for you. You said something I like very much. You said science to challenge management. And that makes me think how effective scientists are. So how effective we are to communicate these things to the farming community. So do you think we are doing you doing enough on your side, or do you think we can do something different to communicate these things better? Because in this conversation it makes a lot of sense, but then when we are outside in the community, it's a lot of confusion.
That's a great question, Gonzalo. There's two aspects to my answer. The first is that as a scientist, whenever I'm challenged about the management practices, I'll point to the 20% of my best farmers and say, this is what we're doing. And when someone's challenging me on that, they'll point to the 20% of the worst farmers and say, but these are the farmers. So we actually don't talk to each other because we're highlighting different aspects. And we've got a normal distribution of farming, haven't we? We've got top practitioners and we've got some that we'd like to exit the industry or change what they're doing. So we have both extremes within our system. My philosophy is I'm really concentrating on the middle part. I want the middle group that are the bulk of the farmers to move. And so we need to communicate that information to them. There is an element of our farming community that will always do things based on the evidence that we as scientists put in front of them. And those people will go to the doctor and they will listen to the doctor and they will believe that the doctor has been well trained and there's some evidence to the prescription that they're being given. But we must remember within the community, there is also a group who are not evidence-based. They're faith-based. They have a belief system.
Yeah.
And their belief system is that this will be better because I believe it will be better. They don't need any evidence to believe that. And so that group we're not going to reach. And that group might have not wanted to take vaccines during COVID, or they might not have engaged in best management practices and the things that we've been promoting. And we need to recognise those people exist within our community and essentially say that, how they farm is up to them. All we can do is put the evidence in front of them and allow them to adopt the systems. For me, the learning journey for me was in working with some of the farmers who were failing, who were struggling, and giving them information and giving them, particularly around lucerne grazing management, for example, but giving them license to fail and saying, when you try this, the first time you do it, you're likely to get it wrong. And that's something we don't do. We often point to this successful farmer, and everybody knows they're successful in the district because they're making money, they're doing great, their farm looks great, but nobody understands their journey to get to that point. And the other farmers are slightly intimidated by that success. Yeah. And so we have to explain to the farming community. I draw a sort of an asymptotic relationship, again, mathematics, but farmers optimize their system as they go through, and they know their system. And then we come along and say, do this. Well, naturally, it's not going to work. And so they're likely to have some failing. But what we're trying to achieve is transformational change. We're trying to take them to a different level of productivity. But we need to give them license to fail. We need to say this isn't going to be easy. Our job as communicators, Gonzalo, is to try and minimize the risk, what I call the risk of reversion. So I went in and told farmers, you need to start grazing alfalfa. They start grazing alfalfa, they end up with 3 animals dead because they've got bloat and 2 more have got red gut, and it's a disaster. And the risk is, I tried that once, I'm never going to do it again. Our job is to ensure that they recognise that there will be mistakes along the way and they won't get it right. So the first thing with a farmer who starts rotationally grazing lucerne is they usually don't start early enough. And so they end up with their sixth paddock that's 50 centimeters tall, and that they're struggling to keep up with the rotation. It's only the second year that they get it right.
Right.
But our job has to be to give them license to fail. And I think that's the bit that we need to be better at, not communicating the actual information, but communicating the behavioral component that, hey, look, what we're trying to do is transform your system. We're trying to not just give you a 1% gain in productivity. I want to give you a 10, 20, 40% gain in productivity. But there's going to be some pain along the way. We're going to make mistakes, but I'll be there when you make those mistakes. And I think that's the key message. It's not necessarily the technical information. It's the social information that it's okay to get it wrong. That mistake is an opportunity to learn.
That's really interesting. And from your perspective, Derek, you've been working and you've been doing extension for 30 years or more, right? So yeah, we won't say your age. Don't worry. Are you seeing, because this is something that I've perceived in Argentina, this related to what Gonzalo was saying, that there's a lot more people communicating, and all these people that have belief systems, right, that they have faith in something, they tend to be very good at communicating, and they tend to be very efficient in terms of getting more people into this sort of religion type of movements, right? So there's no data sometimes to support what they're saying, but there's a lot of enthusiasm, and
But they don't need it, Jose. They don't need it. They just need to sound convincing because it's a belief system.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. But the point is, are you seeing that there's more people now, being appealed by that time, by those systems, and because my perception from Argentina is that there's people are starting to trust less in data, right? So you show them data and yeah, okay, I see the data. I just don't care too much about that data. I have anecdotes from people. I've talked to a farmer who did this and that, and he's really happy with it. And so they showed 2, 3 examples of things that apparently worked. They're very good at showing that, very good at communicating. They believe that deep in their soul, in their hearts, they believe that, and so they convince more people. Are you seeing the same trend in New Zealand? Are you seeing more people that, like 30 years ago, I'm sure that people were more evidence based, but today, are you seeing more people that are sort of faith based?
It's an interesting question, and I think the key answer to that is the people who are struggling tend to be looking for an answer. And they're looking for an answer that they may think that the science community and the evidence has let them down. So they will be looking elsewhere for that answer. And what you will find is that over time, that faith-based system will fall over. And so that's what we've had. We've had 8 years, I guess, 6 to 8 years of a very high profile for a number of these opportunities. But there's been very little uptake. There was a huge marketing push and a lot of enthusiasm for these systems. But as I said to you, one of the most strongest advocates is on my technical advisory group, who's now modified his understanding and actually is a much better grazing manager than he was before he started. He went the full holistic grazing approach and realized that actually his animals were losing weight. He wasn't as productive as he should be, but he learned some management skills because prior to that, he'd been stocked at such a high level that his animals were completely underfed.
Yeah.
And one of the issues we have is that when we overstock, when we're set stocked, we get our critical leaf area or the leaf area index so low that we're not actually capturing all of the light that's available, and our water is being lost from soil evaporation, not transpiration. So it's not going through a plant. So it's inefficient use of our resource. And if you take the principle that we need regenerative grazing, initially you will get a response because of those two things.
Right.
When a plant is short of carbon because it's been overgrazed, it will have a reduction in its root mass.
Mhm.
So the roots become smaller. All of a sudden, I'm no longer resistant to drought. I can bring along a regenerative or holistic system, and all of a sudden that system has an excess of carbon because I've been growing a 4-ton, 5-ton, 6-ton pasture. What does it do with that extra carbon? It puts it in its roots.
Mhm.
So part of the learning for this particular farmer is that his previous grazing management was too intense. He wasn't rotationally grazing. He was set stocked for a long period. He doesn't see what happens below ground. His animals were underfed. He started rotational grazing and it didn't really work when he went to high residuals. But he's now come back and said, I need to graze like a dairy farmer. And I'm going, yes. When we compare set stocking and rotational grazing, people always said you can grow as much out of set stocking as you can rotational grazing. But they forget the point was, but you have to set stock at 1,500 kilos of dry matter or
Exactly.
above.
Yeah.
Okay, because you've got to capture the light, you've got to have the water going through the plant, and we're not at that. We used to be very good at this, but we lose some of those principles, and intensity comes in the spring. I'm overstocked. I'm down to 1,000 kilos. So then a deferred grazing system or a holistic grazing system is going to give me some initial bangs for my buck. It's good.
Right.
But it's actually that I had poor grazing management. Part of the Lucerne system is forcing people to go back and think about their grazing management. If they graze their grass-based pastures with the same thought processes as we've got them using with their Lucerne-based systems, the whole system would get better.
Right.
And that's what we've been trying to get our farmers to do, is to say, look, when you have X percentage of your farm, maybe 20% of your farm is in Lucerne, you're stocking that at twice the rate you are anywhere else. Now, what that's doing is reducing the grazing pressure on your hill country or on your overgrazed areas. And because you do that, you grow more herbage on those areas because you've got, half a stock unit per hectare less or 3 stock units per hectare less, depending on what their productivity is. But the consequence is those plants recover. The small annual legumes set seed. The whole system gets rid of those unpalatable weeds that eventually we end up having in our systems, because they're the only things that can survive the overgrazing that we're putting in there. The woody weeds and the very flat weeds are a consequence of the animals choosing all the stuff they want to eat, and us overgrazing and never giving those pastures a chance to recover.
Okay, sorry, there's so many questions I want to ask there. It's starting from rugby questions, but probably you don't want to talk about rugby now.
I'll tell you at the end of the weekend if we beat England or not.
Let's see what happens. You mentioned. Let me go back to the 20% of the top farmers, and
Yes.
my interpretation is that you focus on that group because you see that group is going to track or pull the rest of the community. So they are the change agents. Okay, so we agree with you, and that's the way we try to do our extension. And my question is, thinking about the new generations, the younger farmers coming onto the stage, and so we know what we want to achieve. But the question is how. So when we talk about the how, is do we need more PhD, more master students, or do we need more extension work, or monitor farms, or probably a combination of all those things? What's your view on that?
That's a really good question, Gonzalo. I got overwhelmed by the number of people trying to contact me when we showed some success. So I think we need lots of different methods of extension. And the most interesting thing for me was my most successful extension piece is a text service. Mm-hmm. So I actually couldn't cope with the number of questions I was getting. You get 10 questions every day from farmers, and you can't deal with all of them as appropriately as you would like to. So Beef and Lamb New Zealand, which is our levy-funded body, came to me and said, well, let's try a text service. So for every week or 2 weeks of the year, I sent a little email, because I'm not the text person. So I sent an email to Beef and Lamb New Zealand, and they created a text, and farmers subscribe to that text service. And it's basically lucerne grazing management through the year. So right now, the farmers are getting messages saying what to do if they've got aphids, how to put their new stands in, information about grazing and things that can go wrong when you're grazing. So having fibre out, having salt out. We have about 1,200 farmers have signed up to that text service. And the interesting thing about that is the levy-funded organisation would say 80% of those farmers have no other interaction with Beef and Lamb New Zealand. So they don't go on the website, they don't go to field days, they don't read extension material. But they get that text service, and the churn on that text service has been incredibly low, about 5%. And often when people leave it, they say, look, I really enjoy getting these texts, but I've actually sold the farm 3 years ago, so I think you should take me off the text service.
Sounds like a
So
yes. Sounds fair.
There's no one size fits all.
Yeah.
And we need to recognize that our farmers are often, they're practical people, and we need to hit them with lots of different modes, and they can then engage in whichever mode suits them the best. They're often visual learners. They learn from other farmers. It's that the fear of, I'm the professor, listening to the professor, that can be daunting to some farmers. Yeah. So it's better if it's coming on a text at their phone, and they can look and go, oh yeah, I should have done that 2 weeks ago. And I base it on what we're doing at Lincoln, and farmers over time work out, I should have been doing that 2 weeks ago, or yep, that's upcoming for me, depending on where they are geographically compared with where we are at Lincoln. And so in the autumn, I'll be giving the messages of, hey, at some point this autumn, you need to let your lucerne have a flowering period. I'll be telling them about the potential for phytoestrogens. I'll be telling them about fibre, putting salt out. All of the things that we've learned when we've been dealing with farmers is there. We always need, at the other end, good PhD students, because as Jose quite politely pointed out, people like me get old. And so we need to replace and replenish those people, and they need to be trained, and we need to have those people coming in. I really enjoy training master's students because they tend to go and work in industry. And I think those people have a lot of connection with farmers. And so one of the things I try to do is if a seed company or a fertilizer company wants me to come and talk to their reps, I'm in their boots and all, because I can't touch 1,000 farmers that easily, but I can touch 15 of those agribusiness community, and they're going to go and touch 50 farmers each. And so I don't need to get the message out to individual farmers, but I do need to get it. I need to educate the extension people. So it's sort of a continuum of the PhD science. We do want to have contact with farmers, because that's often where we get our best ideas. They've got a problem, we try and solve it. Right. So we're working with the leading farmers, but the extension messages often go out through the students that we teach as undergraduates, who then trust us, because let's be quite clear that the whole relationship is about trust. And that's really what we were talking about previously, Jose, with your faith and evidence-based system. It's about trust. And people will respond to, listen to, try things from people they trust. And if I get it wrong and make a mistake, as long as I own up to that mistake and say, look, I got it wrong, I'm sorry, that's okay. The worst thing you can do is dismiss something that you got wrong. So you lose trust quickly, and you lose credibility quickly if you're not prepared to accept when you make a mistake. Own it. And I think as scientists, sometimes we don't want to own that mistake, but I'm quite happy to say, look, I don't know, or I'll find out, or actually we got that wrong. And that's important for getting trust, because the relationship is all about trust. We tend to have more trust with the undergraduate students that we've taught, because they've had us into courses as we've been through. So they are a really good extension opportunity for us. And so I haven't really answered. I think if it's a demonstration farm, it has to be within 30 minutes of where the farmers are.
Okay.
And that's the most difficult thing, is that we can't do lots of those. But really, it has to be close enough that they can drive past it on their way to see what is happening.
Okay.
We can't have an extension farm that is 500 kilometers away from where the farmers are. It's got to be within 30 minutes driving. Maybe it's an hour in Argentina because you're used to driving a whole lot more than we are. But
Yeah.
it has to be close enough that they can visit on a regular basis, even when we're not having a field day. They could drive past and see what's happening. But those extension farms tend to take a huge amount of resource. And
sorry, Derek, but I was wondering, probably well, I think you call the monitor farm. It's a commercial farm that it's a
yes,
private farm that you can help with consultancy and get the numbers right. And that's what I'm thinking about.
yes, and the monitor farm system works very well. And we let the farmers, so the funding body I was talking about, Beef and Lamb New Zealand, they allow the farmers in a particular district to identify if they want to continue with that monitor farm service. Some of the regions have said, we don't think that we want to keep doing that. We want to go to several farms and deal with a particular aspect on different farms.
Oh, really? Okay.
And some of them, the wheel has turned and they've come back and said, we haven't done a monitor farm for a while. We want to do a monitor farm.
Okay.
So I don't think there's a one size fits all. It's how you touch people becomes important. Yeah.
Excellent.
Derek, I want to take you mentioned on our email that we went back and forth that you just came back from Denmark. You have relatives in Denmark, right?
No, I don't.
No.
No.
Who? But your parents were from where?
My father is from Holland, from
Oh,
the Netherlands.
Holland.
He's a
Okay.
1950s immigrant. But I
Okay.
went to Denmark because I'm in the process of writing a textbook, and my
Okay.
co-author is in Denmark. So I went to do some time with him, because the only way you can really get things done is get out of your own office.
Yes, that's yeah, sounds about right. So what there's a lot going on in Europe in terms of agriculture. A lot of the things we've talked about, some of the regenerative ag, but there's also we've actually seen some of the implications for the new policy regarding deforestation laws in LATAM. So, there's a lot going on. What were your impressions while you were there?
I think it's interesting um, to look at the laws that come out of Europe, and you can see that these are laws related to the privileged. So they essentially have food. They're not hungry. They can make laws, and they can have values that are not based on dealing with hunger and poverty and feeding a population. So Denmark was a very interesting case study, because they like to consider themselves an agricultural country and an exporting country. They didn't really want me pointing out that most of their money is actually made from oil and gas that they take out of the North Sea and sell to the Germans. And the Norwegians, it's a similar situation. A lot of renewable energy in that country, but the money that they get for their agricultural systems and the ability to subsidize their farmers comes from selling petrochemical to Germany or other parts of Europe. And the interesting part of that Europe, I'll come back to this. We're going to have to edit this out, because there's a printer just about to go next to the office that I'm sitting in.
No worries.
I can't turn it off either. Anyway, so coming back to, I think Europe has got itself in a bit of a bind. And the bind is that the Germans have bought into the system of energy, and they've shut down their nuclear power plants. So they need coal, or they need, they were reliant on Russian gas for a while. But now, if I'm sitting in Scandinavia, I've got a big market here called Germany, and the price of energy is going up.
Hmm.
And so those countries are making a lot of money out of their energy production. So they can afford to have less efficient agricultural systems, or in their case, they would consider them ecologically or agroecologically sound systems. When we look at that globally, if the whole world went organic, then we have to recognize we'd have about a 20% drop in production.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter which system you go across. You can find an individual study that will show organic production is better than conventional. But if you go across all of the industries, dairy, horticulture, sheep, cropping, it's about a 20% reduction from an organic system. So you need a 20% premium to allow that to be price competitive. But then if you do that globally, you need 20% more land to produce the same amount of food.
Exactly.
And that's where I have trouble in the production systems that are less efficient. The data is starting to generate now. Sustainable intensification is the most efficient way that we can produce food. And that isn't on the horizon. In fact, when I challenged some of my colleagues in Denmark along these lines, they were horrified to think that their systems were actually contributing to destruction of native forest or tropical forests elsewhere in the world. And they didn't want to know that.
One thing leads to
Because
the
they had
other,
never
right? I
thought
mean,
of it.
it's
Sorry?
everything's linked. Everything's
Everything's
linked.
linked.
Yeah.
When I tried to point out that, the soy production coming out of Brazil is heading into Norwegian fish farms, they wanted to think of the fish farms as being a natural system, but they hadn't actually thought about what was going on and where that was coming from. So it's all linked, and that link is lost. And I think that's a problem for Europe going forward. They make their money out of different systems, not out of agriculture. So they're trying to maintain a premium. But the organic systems from a global perspective are going to be difficult for us to sustain. I have no issue. I've got local colleagues here who go down to the local farmers market and buy organic produce. That, again, is a privilege that we have because we have ready access to food in the developed world. But that's not the situation for a lot of people. And we walk that fine line, and the Europeans have had that privilege for a long time, since 1960s, when the Treaty of Rome was signed, and we industrialized agriculture. That's not the situation for a lot of the population.
Yeah. It's sometimes I did have a couple of conversations regarding this organic production, and the figures are there. I mean, it's between 20 and 30% from the meta-analysis that you can read online, and there's papers published. So that sounds accurate. Now, another thing that concerns me of those when we talk about organic systems is that they tend to forget that agricultural systems are open systems, right? So you're taking out nutrients from the soil and essentially putting them in the sewage, right? So you're just taking that to a city, you're moving stuff around, so you're moving nutrients, and there's this sort of a magical thinking that, okay, we'll bring manure to the system. And I'm like, okay, but that manure is coming out from a system that is also removing nutrients. So you're removing nutrients from a farm that uses animals to bring it to another system. So it's sort of like there's a confusion of the way farming works. I mean, it would be a different world if we were, I don't know, 1,000 years ago. It would have been different because everything went on a farm, and people lived.
Jose,
Uh,
Jose, you don't need to go back 1,000 years.
right,
Okay.
right.
1920s.
Yeah.
Okay. So there were 1.5 billion to 2 billion people on the planet. And that's what we could feed.
Exactly.
Okay. And then we didn't have nitrogen fertilizer. And let's not forget, nitrogen fertilizer was the game changer through the 1960s.
Yeah.
Up until the 1960s, the increase in global population was a parallel line with the increase in deforestation. The trade-off was just there. You just had more people, more forest cut down.
Yeah.
The 1960s changed that, and what we're dealing with is that intensification of agriculture comes with costs.
Yeah.
And some of those costs are environmental, but they would be greater if we were trying to feed 8 billion people and we didn't have nitrogen fertilizer.
Yeah.
There wouldn't
Yeah,
be any
great.
Amazon left.
Yeah. Now, can we deal with, because there's always this also talk about, okay, can we deal with the nitrogen fertilizer just by using, do you think that can be solved by using crops? I mean, you can, I don't know, use legumes and do that, then blow that legume onto the soil and eventually grow corn crops or something like that. Can that be a solution? Do you think that can be a solution?
Well, it comes back to first principles. No is the simple answer. And many people have tried this for a long time, but I can only do that if I want to take the legume crop, whatever it may be. So I'm going to take a legume crop and I'm going to mulch it into the soil. So I've taken that land out of production for a period of time because I have to mulch it into the soil. If it's a soybean, or in our case peas, because we're too cold to grow soybean, then actually that plant doesn't leave a lot of nitrogen in the soil.
Hmm.
It takes all of that nitrogen and puts it in the pod.
Yeah.
You know, the plant isn't there to try and put a whole lot of nitrogen in the soil. It's there to grow a seed. And so we have this notional thought that by growing the legumes in our cropping rotations, we're helping. Yes, we are, but nowhere near as much as we think we might be.
Hmm.
If there is nitrogen in the soil, the legume will be lazy and it will use the nitrogen that's there, because it costs the plant about 20% of the carbon it makes every day to feed the rhizobia. So you can never have as high a yield out of a legume crop as you will out of the cereal next to it if the cereal has got nitrogen.
Right.
So the question only is, where do I get my nitrogen from? Now, I can grow my alfalfa, my lucerne crop, for 6 or 7 years grazed, and then I could grow a wheat crop after it, and I wouldn't need any nitrogen for that wheat crop because there's enough in the soil from that urine returns that the plant has put in, and I haven't leached it because I'm in a dryland or low rainfall environment. And we know that for about the next 18 months, we'll get a release of nitrogen. The difficulty with an organic system when you're trying to use legumes is your nitrogen cannot be timed at the time the plant needs it.
Hmm.
So if I'm trying to use nitrogen from a legume-based system, or even if I'm trying to use manure in an organic wheat crop, for example, I'm going to struggle to get the nitrogen into the plant at the time the plant needs it.
Right.
And those windows are quite small when I actually need nitrogen fertilizer. Pre-anthesis, I need some nitrogen in the system. If I've plowed in or mulched in a crop, I have no control on when the microorganisms in the soil are going to break down that crop to release the nitrogen to the following crop. So we lose the ability to time, and therefore we lose some of the efficiency that we can gain from nitrogen fertilizer. So we're never going to get rid of nitrogen fertilizer by having legumes in the system. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have legumes in the system for other reasons. They do some nitrogen fixing. The roots and the nodules will break down and leave some nitrogen for a following crop. But it's usually not enough to grow the following crop well if we're talking about intensive productive
Right.
systems.
Right.
In very extensive systems, it's possible, but in our more intensive systems, you just can't do it. The amount of nitrogen fix just isn't enough. Gonzalo,
Derek, I hope we're not tiring you too much, but this is my last question, at least this time. I read a book a while ago. This is a German writer called Schumacher. He wrote the book. The name of the book is Small is Beautiful. Probably you heard of the book. I mean, it's a book about the future of agriculture in the world. So globally, his thesis was that he was saying that the future of farming is family farming, so small scale farming. So my question to you is, I mean, trying to pick your brains and to know what you think about the future. So let's try to think about globally. What's the future of farming for you?
So again, just my opinion, but if you think about what we've done, the family farm is under pressure and disappearing. Why is it disappearing? It's disappearing because politically, all of our politicians want cheap food. And why they want cheap food is to drive their economic model. So if we go back to those 1920s, Jose, or even through the 1950s, people were spending a high proportion of their salary on food, 30%, 35%. The economic model that we've had for the last 50 years has been to reduce food costs so that people have more money to buy things. And it is the things that we want them to buy that have driven our economies. Okay, we're sitting on a computer, we've got a cell phone, we've got a television. Those things are what have driven our societies. So the only way that the farmers could respond is to get bigger and have economies of scale, because the pressure has been to reduce the price of food. Now, the way to reduce that price of food is to say, we want cheap food to feed the poor. And we don't want the price of food to be high, because if the price of food is high, we're going to put X million people back into poverty and back into food deprivation. But that's not the case for most of us that are sitting in Western democracies or in situations where we've got food. The reality is that it's been a very easy thing to do to drive down the price of food so that consumption can be spent in other areas. And the only way that you can then be productive in a farm system is by getting bigger and having economies of scale. And that's what we've seen historically. So if you go to Europe and you think of some of the Italian and Spanish situations where they didn't have progression of the oldest son, the hierarchical system whereby the oldest son inherited the land, but they split it up and everybody got an equal proportion. Once you get down to about 4 generations, everybody's got a tiny pocket handkerchief of land, and most of them walk off the land and don't want to use it because it's not productive. And so the family farm, I think, is an institution that we need to value, because those people provide other aspects to the rural communities. They're often involved in the school, they're involved in the community fundraising, they're the essence and the most important component of land stewardship. And we should never lose sight of that fact.
Yeah.
And we want to maintain them, but they're going to be under more and more pressure because it's economies of scale that drives down production costs. And ultimately, that's been a political decision. And no politician that you talk to wants to admit that process. Once we've got past peak things, and I suspect in Western economies, we've got past peak things. Everybody has everything they want. We don't really all need a Fabergé egg. But most people have access to the things that they want. And so the next aspect was then, well, your life is not fulfilled unless you're doing a lot of travel. So you can see this shift from the late 1990s to the 2010s was about peak things. But once the computers came along and we got all the digital stuff, people are going, well, what else do I need? So it became, you need experiences.
Yeah.
You need to travel to this place and see this thing, or you need to jump off this building, or you need to reconnect with these people who are half a world away, so you've got to get on and fly. And all of those things are about driving an economic model that is based on cheap food.
Wow.
You and I would turn around and say, people don't pay enough for their food.
Okay.
And the contrary argument to that would be, but if we put the price of food up, we will put X number of people into food insecurity.
Yeah, so we need education, basically. A lot of education. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's a fantastic. I hadn't thought of it like that, really, and it's it makes perfect sense. Um, Look, so it's been like an hour and a half, and it's your Saturday, so we're stealing some of your free time. I mean, it's been amazing. We've gone through a lot of topics, and you've been extremely clear in all of them. So, um, I don't have any other questions, and I don't want to put you through any more questions, really. So, I just want to thank you. Really, you've been extremely clear, and you've been very when you answered my email, you said, "Hey, yeah, I'd like to join." So I was really excited to have you here, and to try to tell some of your story and your background. So thank you, Derek, for this opportunity, for uh, you know, gifting us with your time, and we'll certainly bother you again probably in the future. We'll let a year pass or something, so you can rest from this. But there's a lot of topics, and some of the things you've mentioned. I always say that you were my mentor. I think you were my mentor, and you were one of the people that really inspired me to do a lot of things. So it's really special for me having you here, and you also showed me some of the books. I read some of the books you mentioned. We didn't talk about Doug Avery, but I think you mentioned something uh, about his story, and so there's a lot of things that we can go over in a next conversation, a next episode, hopefully. So I don't know if you, Gonzalo, have anything else to add or
Oh, just thank you so much, Derek. I heard so much about you, and it's a privilege for me to be here with you and to see what you did with Jose. Jose is a leader in our community now. So mentorship is something very important for community as well. So I enjoyed it very much. I appreciate your time, and I hope you can come to Argentina one day again, or we can come and visit you sometime, and we keep this contact alive. So thank you so
You're
much.
always welcome. And as long as the All Blacks are winning, then I'm happy.
Yeah, we support All Blacks. We love the All
yeah,
Blacks,
of
but
course we do.
now the Pumas are strong. So
All
It's
right.
been fun. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's not often that I get to just sort of let my opinions out. But as you can say, I think about these things a lot because you're thinking about what is it that we're telling students? You're constantly questioning, am I telling them the right information?
Yeah.
Am I setting them up for a future that is positive for them, for their families, and for the community at large? And unless you have those wider perspectives, you're going to doubt yourself in terms of what you're teaching and what you're providing in that sort of mentorship role that you discussed, Jose.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Will do.
thank you, Derek.
Bye bye.
Have a
Cheers,
good one.
guys.
Bye bye. See you guys.
See you, Derek. Thank you very much.